32. This represents 52.1% of the final vote. I therefore declare Humza Yousaf duly elected as the Scottish National Party leader.
It's never easy starting a new job.
I will be a First Minister for all of Scotland. That I will work every minute of every day to earn and to re-earn your respect and your trust.
Humza Yousaf has got to do it, though, knowing he's following in the footsteps of a hugely successful First Minister. Nicola Sturgeon was a formidable communicator. She carved out a powerful public image for herself, winning elections, overseeing political dominance for the SNP in Scotland. And as if all that isn't daunting enough, Humza Yousaf also needs to unify the party after a rather bruising leadership battle. And it wasn't a great look for the SNP. Dirty laundry was aired, the subject of gay marriage was questioned, and it emerged SNP members have deserted the party in the tens of thousands.
We are no longer Team Humza or Team Ash or Team Kate. We are one team, and we will be the team. We will be the generation that delivers independence for Scotland. Where there are divisions to heal, we must do so quickly, because we have a job to do.
So what does all this mean for Scottish independence with Humza Yousaf as First Minister? I'm Sally Lockwood, and this is the Sky News Daily. Now, we're recording this podcast shortly after the big reveal at Murrayfield Stadium when Humza Yousaf was announced as the winner.
This is probably the least shocking result in this contest.
Our Scottish correspondent Conor Gillies was just a few feet away from the podium and joins me now from the road as he makes his way from Murrayfield back to Holyrood.
Humza Yousaf was seen as the favoured candidate from the outset. He's been at the helm of government for almost a decade, was recently serving as Scotland's Health Secretary in charge of the devolved NHS. And he is a close ally of Nicola Sturgeon and the outgoing team at the top of government. So this win is a big victory for the SNP establishment, but I think it's far from surprising.
Now, he's seen as the continuity candidate, isn't he, Conor? And, you know, he was certainly ahead in the polls among SNP members, but not among the wider public. Kate Forbes was the more popular candidate. So what do you think this means for him?
Humza Yousaf spent his entire campaign, this 5-week campaign, pivoting his conversation directly to the 70,000 SNP members who did have a vote in this ballot. And that was not the approach that his rival Kate Forbes took. She thought it was important that if the SNP is to achieve that mission, that goal of independence, then she needed to bring the public on side and convince those who voted no in 2014, bring them back on side and build that case for independence. Humza Yousaf took a very different approach. The polls were telling us a story that he was the most popular out of all three candidates when it came to those internal members. However, between him and Kate Forbes, he was the least favourable candidate between those branding him the most weak, incompetent and untrustworthy. And that's something that I put directly to him in that Q&A that happened in those immediate moments after he became the SNP leader.
I'm delighted to be part of that election-winning machine and being part of government for 10 and a half years. But on top of that, of course, I'm delighted that when I've stood for election, I've been elected and re-elected with a big majority from the people of Glasgow Pollock, who I'd like to thank and putting their trust in me over the years. But what I'll make sure I do is I govern, and govern in the interest of the people of Scotland. But also, we win the trust of the people of Scotland when we govern and we align with their priorities. Their priorities have to be our priorities. And of course, they will look to us for delivery, and I will do my best to deliver what is their priorities. And at the moment, I don't have to tell anybody in this room that people are suffering from a cost of living crisis. That'll be my first and immediate priority to try to help.
One of the most immediate challenges now is how he transforms his fortunes into talking to the wider public and creating a message that will continue to build on the SNP's election-winning fortunes of the last 20 years or so.
Now, Conor, I was really interested by the story that emerged showing, SNP members have deserted the party in droves. And the SNP initially tried to deny the story when it was broken. The spin doctor Murray Foote called the story drivel, then resigned when it emerged it was true. What's going on?
When this row erupted just during the course of the campaign, this suggestion that the SNP was not being transparent with its numbers. It had been thought it had around 100,000 members. And the Sunday Mail here in Scotland, the newspaper, said that it had obtained information that it had drastically lost numbers down to around 70,000. Now, at that point, the SNP and the hierarchy within headquarters here in Edinburgh denied that report. Murray Foote, as you say, the chief spin doctor, was sent out to rubbish that piece of journalism. And the party came under sustained pressure to publish its true figures. And when it eventually U-turned and did reveal those figures, a loss of tens of thousands in the space of just 18 months. That led to all sorts of rows within the senior members of the SNP.
And is there any idea or any clarity yet, Connor, as to why so many members have left the Scottish National Party?
The party said the reasons for the huge drop in membership numbers, a loss of a third of their members, could be largely in part, down to the cost of living crisis and people not having the money, the cash to spend on those membership fees at a time when household budgets are already stretched to breaking point. Critics of the party would suggest that the almighty row around gender reforms, that piece of legislation, controversial piece of legislation here in Scotland to make it easier to change your gender, allowing 16 and 17-year-olds the option to change their gender without any doctor interfering at any point, that created a lot of unease among certain wings of the party.
Just on the gender recognition bill, Connor, of course, it was passed in Holyrood, blocked in Westminster. What happens now? Humza Yousaf was in support of that bill, wasn't he?
He was around the cabinet table when that decision was being made. And Humza Yousaf is putting himself on a constitutional clash on day one already with the UK government, who are blocking this legislation because they say it is having a negative impact, or could have a negative impact, on UK-wide equality laws. Humza Yousaf has said that he will fight this in court because it's important that devolution is respected.
Let's take a closer look now at what the new SNP leader means for the future of the party and just what damage was done by the rather brutal leadership contest.
I think there will be a lot of huge sighs of relief among the politicians in the party, not least Nicola Sturgeon, the outgoing First Minister.
Shona Craven is a columnist at The National, the newspaper which backs Scottish independence.
It was widely accepted that Humza Yousaf was her preferred winner of this race. Yes, a lot less controversy about sort of bringing the party back together, especially at Holyrood and forming a government and choosing a cabinet.
Humza Yousaf was the most popular candidate, according to the polls, within the SNP, but not within the wider Scottish public. Kate Forbes was ahead in those polls. How do you think he's going to get on? Is he going to be able to cut through?
Well, he's very well known to the Scottish public, but he has had some pretty challenging briefs. You know, he was the Justice Secretary. He presided over the hate crime bill, which has proved very controversial and has actually yet to be implemented. And then he took over the job of Health Secretary during the COVID pandemic. So that was never going to be easy. He was always going to be under pressure there. But, you know, he would point himself to the fact that the figures on the health service in terms of A&E, etc., are better than England. And that's not the benchmark that Scotland wishes to set itself against, but it still is a pretty strong retort to people who suggest that he's failed, you know, as health secretary. I'm not saying that it's an easier job being First Minister than it is being health secretary, but I don't think it'd be too sad to see that job go.
Shona, let's just go over what Kate Forbes said about Humza Yousaf. She was very critical of his record in government generally, claiming that trains were never on time when he was the Transport Secretary, that the police were at breaking point when he was Justice Secretary, and of course now the NHS has had many crises, not least the longest ever waiting lists while he was at the helm on the health brief. Does she have a point?
Well, I think those statements were all extremely over the top. I mean, obviously, the trains were sometimes on time, and I think mostly on time, although I'm sure it often didn't feel like that to some commuters. And overall crime fell. Now, can a Justice Secretary necessarily take credit for that? Perhaps not. It's a kind of ongoing trend. And obviously, if we're creating new crimes, then you might expect crime to go up. And I think with the NHS, you really have a very strong argument that you are doing that with one hand tied behind your back in terms of not having influence over immigration policy, in terms of obviously budgetary restrictions which apply across all Scottish government areas. And of course, the backdrop of the pandemic. Humza Yousaf has constantly been apologising for the state of things, but as an SNP politician, he would be the first to acknowledge that there's a lot of factors that impact on that. One of which, of course, is things like income tax and retaining well-paid doctors in Scotland. And I wonder if you might have a little bit of a conflict there with some of the things he said about progressive taxation and the sort of brutal reality of how to run a country post-Brexit within the current devolution settlement.
Let's move on now to the debate over gay marriage that we heard cropping up during this contest. Has the perception that Scotland is super progressive with its gender recognition bill been undone in this leadership contest with all this discussion about views on gay marriage, something that for many was put to bed in 2014 and is viewed as a very straightforward issue to most voters?
It was put to bed in 2014, and there was absolutely no suggestion that if Kate Forbes had won, that she would seek to revisit and reopen and change anything in regard to that. And it's interesting that the sort of way you frame the question, a lot of people in Scotland do not regard the gender recognition reform bill as progressive at all, because they see the ways in which it can impact negatively on the rights of women and girls, but also more broadly, some of the discourse about equality and who's progressive and who's backwards. There's a lot to get into with that.
What does this outcome, Humza Yousaf now winning, mean for independence? Does it feel closer or further away, in your opinion, in a post-Sturgeon era?
There's a question of whether Humza Yousaf can rally the troops or indeed delegate rallying of the troops to someone else successfully, so that everyone who currently supports independence, which includes Green voters, which includes non-voters, which includes people who are in Alex Salmond's Alba party, can Humza Yousaf ensure that the people who support independence now will continue to support it, will continue to have faith that there will be an opportunity to have another vote on independence, but also can he convert undecided or current no voting people to the cause? I think the latter will be much trickier. The former, because he's obviously the preferred candidate of the Greens, he can probably keep them on side, although the Greens have been making a lot of quite fighting talk about how tough they'll be about whether they will continue to support the SNP making various demands. There's a central conflict at the heart of what Humza Yousaf has been trying to do. He's been trying to argue that Scotland can be a better place under his leadership. But obviously, in order to argue for independence, you have to keep reminding people of the limits to what you can do as a devolved administration. So that's constantly a problem. It won't necessarily play well to say, well, anything that's going well, it's all my responsibility, and anything that's going badly, it's the limits of devolution. Even if that's true, people don't necessarily like to hear what they consider to be excuses. And a lot of what all the candidates promised during the leadership campaign, I'm not convinced they can deliver under the current constitutional setup.
Do you think the SNP's focus on independence has come at a cost to other domestic issues, such as, we've seen the attainment gap in schools that hasn't been closed? Scotland's got a shameful record on drug-related deaths, problems in the NHS. Do you think we're going to see Humza Yousaf focus more on these domestic issues?
Yes, in the short term, definitely, as part of his stated aim of boosting support for independence. I've noticed when he's asked about education, he focuses very much on the links between poor attainment and poverty. So, and obviously everyone agrees children can't be hungry at school, breakfast clubs are a good thing, making sure that children can concentrate, but it's not just about money. So I think he needs to get away from just talking about attainment as being inextricably linked to, a child being poor and a child being hungry, and broaden that out a little bit.
We can't talk about Humza Yousaf's victory, Shona, without talking about the historic sense of this moment. He's the first Muslim to lead a major UK party, the first Asian to take control of a devolved administration. And he touched on this in his acceptance speech, speaking of his grandparents who arrived in Scotland from Punjab.
Unfortunately, they're no longer alive to see this day, but I'm forever thankful that my grandparents made the trip from Punjab to Scotland over 60 years ago. As immigrants to this country who knew barely a word of English, they could not have imagined in their wildest dreams that their grandson would one day be on the cusp of being the next First Minister of Scotland.
It's quite a story.
He has talked about how his parents would have much rather, in a very Asian stereotypical way, him become a doctor or a dentist or an accountant or something like that. And so while some people are a bit cynical about what they term a career politician, somebody who they sort of perceive to be, I don't know, in some way disingenuous, there is also, he does also have a real background in charitable volunteering and getting involved in things like that. And I think what we've seen in Humza Yousaf as he's evolved as a politician is that he's perhaps a little less hot-headed than he was. He's very passionate, as he'll say, about equalities issues, not least as a minority, an ethnic minority and religious minority.
Humza Yousaf is now following in the footsteps of political giants with Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. How tough do you think that's going to be for him?
It will be tough. I think until the next general election, he can take the time to sort of set out his stall. And I think even in the leadership campaign, you could see him adjusting his policies and adjusting his message in response to what was going down well or going down badly. And I don't think there's necessarily anything hugely wrong with that. So I think he'll continue to listen to his own members, especially given how close the vote was, and also to the wider public, because, there's no point just trying to plough on with a path that you think's best if you don't think it's going to continue the electoral success that was achieved under the previous leaders.
Let's bring Conor back to see what he thinks lies ahead now in terms of Humza Yousaf's priorities.
The big question is, how will he tackle independence? Because we know that Nicola Sturgeon failed to deliver the SNP's central mission. It's hard to say exactly how that will happen anytime soon, because the polls are certainly not shifting in that direction.
If Humza Yousaf wanted to hold an Indie Ref 2, something that Nicola Sturgeon didn't succeed in doing, but to have another independence referendum in Scotland, what would he need in order for that to happen?
I don't want to bore you with all the ins and outs of the different acts and legislation, but the Scotland Act says the way that it's set up at the moment and the way that Holyrood is set up is that the UK and Scottish Government needs to come to an agreement. So that was called the Edinburgh Agreement back in 2014. It's when the then Prime Minister David Cameron agreed that the polls were looking like there should be a referendum at that point. Both sides agreed, and that's what happened in September of 2014. What's changed since then is we've had a raft of prime ministers at Westminster who have said now is not the time to rerun that question. As it stands, Holyrood does not have the powers to hold a second independence referendum to the gold standard. That phrase, that awful phrase actually, that's always used when we're comparing 2014. So that will not happen anytime soon. Rishi Sunak has made it clear that he will not be shifting his position on that. So it leaves it up to Humza Yousaf to determine whether he wants to use the next general election or elections further into the future to try and secure independence.
I know how long it takes to get from Murrayfield to Holyrood, so I'm sure you're pretty much back there by now. Thank you so much for joining us.
You couldn't make up the timing. We're literally pulling up this set. So that was great timing, good use of time. So, yeah.
Flawless timing. My thanks to Conor Gillies and Shona Craven, and to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Sally Lockwood. This episode was produced by Annie Joyce. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.